The corridor smelled like burning circuitry and old blood when the first alarm cut through the silence. Sergeant Dara Voss pressed her back against the cold titanium wall, rifle raised, eyes tracking the shifting shadows at the far end of the diplomatic wing. 12 hours ago, she'd been assigned to the simplest post in the Hegemony Fleet, ceremonial guard at the Peace Summit aboard the neutral station Meridian. No combat expected.
No threats flagged.
Just stand still, look sharp, and let the diplomats talk. That was before the Vreth delegation ship exploded in Docking Bay 7. Now smoke curled through the ventilation shafts, emergency lights painted everything a sickly red, and, somewhere ahead of her in the darkness, something moved. Voss, sit rep. Commander Halsey's voice crackled through her earpiece, tight and clipped. Movement in Corridor 11. Could be survivors. Could be hostiles. She kept her voice flat. Emotion was a distraction. The Vreth Queen's quarters are 40 meters ahead. No confirmation she evacuated. A pause. Then, hold position. Do not engage without authorization. She didn't answer. She was already moving. The Vreth had been humanity's enemy for 6 years. Not enemies the way rival corporations are enemies. Enemies the way fire and paper are enemies. Their first contact with human space had been the annihilation of the Callaway colony. 40,000 people. No warning.
No demands.
Just silence where a city used to be. The war that followed had consumed 3 generations of soldiers and left scars on both species that no treaty could fully close. This summit was supposed to change that. 9 months of back-channel negotiations. Concessions that made politicians on both sides furious. A fragile, impossible hope. And, now the docking bay was ash and someone had put shaped charges on the Vreth Queen's life support conduits. Voss had spotted the severed lines when she'd swept the corridor 20 minutes ago. She hadn't reported it yet. She was still calculating what it meant. Who benefits from a dead Vreth Queen during a peace summit? Not humanity. Not officially. But someone wearing a human uniform had done this. She cleared the next corner and stopped. The Queen was on the floor. Voss had seen Vreth soldiers before, tall, insectoid, their exoskeletons the color of midnight, 4 upper limbs ending in razor-edged manipulators. They moved like violence made physical. She'd fought them on Kessel Station. She'd watched them tear through hardened infantry like paper. The Vreth were not creatures that inspired sympathy. But the figure on the floor was small. Not the Queen, a child. A Vreth juvenile, maybe 3 feet tall, its exoskeleton still the pale amber of youth. It crouched beside a larger body, its smaller limbs pressed against the adult's thorax in a gesture Voss recognized without needing a cultural briefing. The child was trying to stop the bleeding. The adult Vreth, not the Queen, a guard, based on the rank markings Voss had memorized from the intelligence files, was alive but barely. A deep puncture wound had collapsed part of its thoracic cavity. The child made no sound. It just pressed and pressed with its small hands, and the blood kept coming anyway. Voss lowered her rifle by 3 inches. She did not lower it completely. That would have been stupid. The child looked up. Its compound eyes caught the red emergency light and threw it back at her in fractured pieces. It did not move. It did not attack. It watched her with an alien stillness that she recognized, because she'd worn that same stillness herself, the night her unit was wiped out on Kessel Station and she'd been the only one left standing, too exhausted to be afraid anymore. The look of someone who has run out of options and is simply waiting to see what the universe decides to do next. Voss clicked her rifle to safe. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't orders. It was the only honest response to what she was seeing. She moved forward slowly, keeping her hands visible, and crouched down across from a child. The injured guard's breathing was a wet, labored rasp. She pulled her emergency medkit from her thigh pouch, standard issue, designed for human biology, almost certainly useless here, and held it out anyway. The child stared at it. "I know," Voss said quietly. "Wrong species. But it's what I have." The station shook. Another explosion, somewhere deeper in the structure. The lights flickered. Voss made a decision then, that she knew would either end her career or define it. She keyed her earpiece. "Commander Halsey. I need a Vreth medical team to Corridor 11 immediately. I have a critically injured guard and a juvenile. And I need someone to tell me where the Queen is, because if she's still on this station, she's the target and Whoever did this isn't finished. A long silence. Then, Halsey said, very carefully, Voss, what exactly are you doing? She looked at the child, who was still watching her with those fractured compound eyes. My job, she said. Just maybe not the way anyone expected. The Vreth medical team didn't come. What came instead, 40 seconds later, was the Queen herself. Voss heard her before she saw her, the distinctive resonant click of Vreth royalty, a biological sound produced by specialized structures in the thorax that human linguists had spent years trying to categorize. It wasn't language exactly. It was closer to the way a ship's hull groaned under pressure, a sound that communicated mass and weight and the promise of consequence. The Queen filled the corridor entrance. She was everything the intelligence files had promised and nothing like what they'd prepared Voss for. 7 feet tall. Exoskeleton the deep violet black of mature Vreth royalty, traced with bioluminescent markings that pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. 4 primary limbs, 2 secondary, all moving with the controlled precision of something that had never needed to hurry because nothing had ever successfully threatened it. Her facial structure was built around compound eyes so large they seemed to gather all the light in the corridor and convert it to cold intelligence. She looked at Voss. She looked at the child. She looked at the dying guard. Something passed through her bioluminescent markings, a ripple of color that moved from her thorax to the tips of her upper limbs. Voss had no idea what it meant. But the child made a small sound, the first sound it had made, and pressed itself closer to the injured guard. Voss stayed exactly where she was. Standing would have been perceived as aggression. Retreating would have been perceived as fear. She'd read enough of the Vreth behavioral files to know that the Queen was currently deciding, in these exact seconds, what category Voss belonged to. Enemy. Obstacle. Something else. The Queen spoke. Her translator unit, a small device visible at the junction of her neck and thorax, rendered the words into flat, accented standard. You did not run. No, Voss said. You did not call for reinforcements before approaching the child. I called after. A beat. The child needed someone present. Reinforcements needed time. The Queen's markings shifted again. Her gaze moved to the medkit still open in Voss's hand, then to the way Voss's other hand remained visible and away from her weapon. You knew your medicine would not work. Yes. Then, why offer it? Voss thought about the real answer. The real answer was complicated. Something about the child's hands pressing uselessly against the wound, something about a night on Kessel Station when she'd been the one pressing uselessly, and a Vreth soldier had walked past her without striking because she'd been too small a target to bother with, and she'd never been sure if that was mercy or indifference, but either way she was alive because of it. The real answer involved 6 years of war and 40,000 dead on Callaway and the way the child's stillness had looked exactly like grief. She gave the Queen the shorter answer instead. Because doing nothing wasn't an option. Silence. The station groaned around them. Somewhere in the deeper corridors, she could hear running footsteps, multiple sets, moving fast. Her earpiece crackled with overlapping traffic, security teams, her commander demanding updates, someone reporting that the eastern docking ring was locked down. The Queen moved. Not toward Voss. She moved to the child, folded herself down with a fluid grace that seemed impossible given her size, and pressed one large limb against the child's back. The child leaned into her. The Queen's other primary limb reached toward the dying guard and applied pressure with a precision that told Voss she'd done this before, had been trained in field medicine, or had simply lived long enough to learn it through necessity. His name is Kethvar, the Queen said, without looking up. He has guarded my house for 14 years. The child is his daughter. A pause. She was not supposed to be on this station. Voss said nothing. She recognized a confession when she heard one, not of wrongdoing, but of love. The kind you didn't plan for. The kind that showed up and complicated everything. Who did this? The Queen asked. I don't know yet. But the charges were placed on your life support conduits first. The docking bay was secondary, probably to prevent your evacuation. Voss kept her voice even. Someone wanted the summit to fail and wanted you blamed for the failure, or dead, or both. The Queen's markings went very still. That stillness, Voss was beginning to understand, was the Vreth equivalent of fury held in absolute check. Your people, the Queen said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a question asking for precision. Someone using human equipment and Human access codes, Voss said carefully. That doesn't tell me who gave the orders. She met the Queen's compound gaze directly. There are factions on my side that don't want this peace. The same is probably true on yours. A long moment. The running footsteps were getting closer. Then, the Queen did something that Voss had no protocol for. She reached out, not toward her, not aggressively, and placed 2 fingers of her secondary limb on the floor between them. A gesture. An offering of space. Of acknowledged proximity without demand. Voss recognized it from the files. It was a Vreth gesture used between equals who had chosen not to be enemies. She placed 2 fingers on the floor across from the Queen's. The footsteps rounded the corner. 6 Vreth royal guards, weapons raised, moving to form a wall between the Queen and Voss. 3 human security officers appeared from the opposite direction, equally tense, equally armed. Everyone stopped. Voss stood slowly. She did not reach for her weapon. "Stand down," she said to the human officers. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had stopped asking permission. "We have a medical situation and a security threat that requires joint response. That's the priority." One of the officers, young, scared, rifle shaking slightly, looked past her at the Vreth Queen. "Sergeant, protocol states." "I know what protocol states." She turned to look at him, and something in her expression made him go quiet. "Right now the person who set those charges is still on this station. Every second we spend pointing weapons at the wrong people is a second they use to disappear. So make a choice." The choice got made. Not cleanly, nothing in the next 3 hours was clean, but it got made. The human security officers lowered their weapons first. It cost them something visible, something Voss understood. 6 years of conditioning, of training that had coded Vreth as Threat Category 1 into muscle memory. They did it anyway. That mattered. The Vreth Royal Guard took longer. They looked to the Queen. She made a sound, low, resonant, that same thoracic register that communicated mass and weight, and they stepped back. Not all the way. But enough. Kethvar was moved to the station's medical bay, the human and Vreth medics working side by side with translation units running hot and a lot of terse, precise communication that had no room for politics. He survived. Voss found out later that the human trauma surgeon had improvised a pressure technique that the Vreth medic had then adapted using Vreth physiology knowledge, and the result was something neither of them had done before. They named it in the medical report with both their last names hyphenated. That also mattered. The child, the Queen called her Sailor, stayed in the medical bay and refused to leave her father's side. The Queen sat beside her. Voss posted herself outside the door. Commander Halsey arrived out too, took one look at the situation, and said nothing for a long moment. "You went off protocol," he said finally. "Yes, sir. The summit committee is saying you may have prevented an interstellar incident or started one. They haven't decided which." "Which do you think?" He looked through the medical bay window at the Queen sitting beside a Vreth child on a human hospital bench, her bioluminescent markings cycling slowly in what Voss was starting to read as something like exhaustion. "I think," Halsey said carefully, "that the person who planted those charges is in custody in Bay 4, and that we found them because the Queen's Guard and your security team ran a joint sweep that neither group could have run alone." He paused. "I also think that someone is going to have to explain to both governments how that happened. I'll write the report. It'll be reviewed at the highest levels." "I know." He nodded once and left. That was as close to approval as Halsey got. The person in custody was human. Mid-level logistics officer named Carver, someone with access codes, motive, and 30 years of grief that had curdled into certainty that peace was betrayal. He'd lost family on Callaway. Voss understood the math of that grief even as she understood that the answer he'd chosen was wrong in a way that didn't leave room for argument. She wrote that in the report too. At hour 4, the Queen came to find her. Voss was in the corridor, running on bad coffee and the specific alertness that came from too much adrenaline over too many hours. The Queen moved quietly for something her size. Voss heard her anyway. They stood in the corridor in the fading emergency light. The station had restored main power, but the lighting in this section was still cycling back up, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then, the Queen said, "Sailor asked me who you were." "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were the human who stayed." Voss absorbed that. Is that a good thing? In your culture. It is the highest thing, the Queen said. To stay when leaving would be easier. To act when inaction would be safer. Her marking shifted, that ripple again, but slower, more deliberate. My people have a word for it. It does not translate well. Try. A pause. The translator unit hummed softly. The closest your language comes, the Queen said, is weight-bearer. Someone who takes on what others will not carry. Voss thought about Kessel Station, about the choice she'd made in this corridor 4 hours ago, about Carver in Bay 4, and the 40,000 on Callaway, and the summit delegates who were, right now, apparently still at the table. Halsey had confirmed it. The summit was continuing. Delayed, shaken, but continuing. Your language has a word for someone like that too, the Queen said. It wasn't a question. Soldier, Voss said.
No.
The Queen's compound eyes caught the returning light. Not soldier. Something older. The word you use when you speak of someone who held a line that mattered. Voss didn't answer. Her throat had done something inconvenient. The Queen reached out then. Slowly, the movement telegraphed and, deliberate, and, placed 2 fingers of her secondary limb against Voss's forearm. Not grasping. Not restraining. The same gesture from the corridor, but closer now. Contact between enemies who had chosen something else. Voss did not pull back. The lights finished their cycle and came fully on. The corridor looked ordinary again. Metal walls, scuffed floor, the distant sound of a station returning to function. Somewhere deeper in the medical bay, Sailor made a small sound, and both of them heard it, and both of them knew what it was. A child whose father was going to live. The summit, the Queen said, withdrawing her hand with the same deliberate care. There are those on my council who will use tonight as evidence that peace is impossible. That your people cannot be trusted. There are people on my side saying the same thing. Yes. A pause. And yet here we are. Here we are, Voss agreed. The Queen turned to go. Then, she stopped. Sergeant Voss. She did not turn around. Her markings had stilled. No ripple, no shift. Just the slow, steady pulse of her resting bioluminescence in the bright corridor light. If the summit succeeds, it will be because someone stayed when they did not have to. People on both sides will claim the credit. They will write speeches about vision and courage and the arc of history. Voss waited. They will not mention the corridor, the Queen said. They will not mention a child's hands on a wound, or a medkit offered across a line, or 2 sets of fingers on a floor. No, Voss said. They won't. Does that trouble you? She thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, in the 3 seconds before she answered, because the Queen had asked it like it deserved a real answer. No, she said finally. The corridor happened. That doesn't change. The Queen's markings rippled once, just once, and, then, she walked back toward the medical bay, back toward the child and the injured guard and the long, complicated work of what came next. Voss stood in the corridor alone. Her earpiece crackled. Halsey, telling her the summit committee wanted a debrief, that both governments' representatives were asking questions, that her name was in 3 separate incident reports and the day was about to get significantly more complicated. She clicked her rifle back to ready and started walking. The summit would either hold or it wouldn't. The peace would either last or it wouldn't. History would remember whatever it chose to remember and flatten everything else into the margins. She'd seen enough of history to know that was how it worked. But, in a corridor on a neutral station, in the red glow of emergency lights, a Vrethchild had pressed her hands against a wound and refused to give up, and a human soldier had lowered her weapon and stayed. And neither of them had needed permission to do it. That was enough. That had to be enough. She turned the corner into the main hub, where the lights were fully on and the future was waiting, and she walked toward it without slowing down.